Welcome back to Face the Nation. I am Major Garrett. As promised, we continue our conversation with North Carolina Republican Mark Meadows, chair of the House Freedom Caucus, conservative side of the Republican.
Without a doubt.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
You've also been mentioned, Congressman, a lot of jobs. Chief of Staff, President of the United States. You want that job?
You know, really, General Kelly is doing a great job, and contrary to a lot of the headlines that are out there, I can tell you that I don't believe his job's in jeopardy. I know that the president has not spoken to me or Mick Mulvaney about replacing him. In fact, quite the opposite. In my conversations with the president, he has expressed confidence in General Kelly, and certainly he's brought order and responsibility to the White House.
One thing I have heard about General Kelly is that he is not as adept in politics as perhaps a chief of staff should be. Do you worry about that?
Nor should he be. He was a general. I mean, and so, you know, it's incumbent upon a lot of us.
From your point of view, is that an important part of the job?
Well, it's an important part of the job, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we give him the political backdrop that maybe some of these decisions are being made. I know that he's reached out to me a number of times on a number of different issues, and so he's not managing in a vacuum. He's truly trying to make sure that the president gets the best information. I believe he does that.
Could the president have fought harder on this budget deal?
Well, I think the president was faced with a choice.
Were you expecting him to
Well,
fight
I was expecting him to continue to push back on draining the swamp, and but yet he was given a binary choice: either you support the military and support this particular budget, or you don't. And I can tell you that that's not the choice that many of us on Capitol Hill believed was before us. It was either supporting the military or continuing what I would say the traditions of the Senate. At some point, we're going to have to say, Mitch McConnell, enough is enough. 51 votes on anything that is of national security interest. It is time that we change this. The American people, your viewers right now, could care less about the traditions of the Senate.
And
they do care about their pocketbook. And what we've done is we've actually taken money from them to grow the size of government by almost 13%. You know, Major, I can't believe it.
So without putting too fine a point on it, how deep is the swamp now?
Well, the swamp is obviously deeper, but when you look at $300 billion over a 10-year period, you know, it makes even a drunken sailor blush. And the problem with that is the drunken sailor actually spent his own money. We've got the government spending yours.
Immigration.
Yeah.
Bottom line for House Freedom Caucus, once something comes from the Senate, what must it have to get through the House of Representatives?
Well, the Speaker of the House needs to do what he said he would do, and that is to whip the Good Labrador bill, put it on the floor, make sure that it passes out of the House. We are the most conservative body, and we've got a bill ready to go. And Chairman Goodlatte.
In other words, the Speaker should not wait for the Senate. Do that now.
Absolutely not. If we're going to wait for the Senate, why don't we all go home, take naps, and wait for 60 senators to decide what we're going to do as a nation? I didn't sign up for that, and most people that elected me didn't want me to sign up for that. So it's critical that we go ahead and work, and that's where you're going to see the Freedom Caucus engaging over the next couple of weeks. We're going to engage and hold our Speaker to his word, which said that he was going to whip the Goodlatte bill and make sure that it has the threshold and then send it to the Senate.
You're very good at this. 15 seconds. What's in the bill? The 4 pillars?
Well, the 4 pillars are in there, but the biggest thing is it puts an emphasis on border security and not creating a special pathway to citizenship.
Very good. Congressman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Major.
Great to have you on Face the Nation. We'll be back with our panel. Please stay with us. Now for some in-depth analysis. Who doesn't love that after a very busy week here in Washington? We are joined now by our expert panel. Susan Glasser is the Chief International Affairs columnist at Politico. Ramesh Ponnuru is Senior Editor at the National Review. He's got a couple of other titles, also with the American Enterprise Institute and Bloomberg View. We want to welcome to this program Susan Davis to the broadcast. She is a congressional correspondent with National Public Radio. And Peter Beinart is a contributing editor at The Atlantic and a CNN political commentator. Wow, that's a mouthful now that that's all out of the way. Susan, I want to set the domestic stuff aside just for a second because I'm fascinated by what's going on at the Olympics and all of what the South Koreans perceive as this unbelievable propaganda coup so far for the North Koreans. What should we make of it?
Well, you know, they're calling it the Olympic opening. And, you know, it's pretty striking that Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, has basically decided to use the Olympics as a way of stealing a march on the Trump administration. That extraordinary picture, right, from the other day of Kim's sister sitting feet away from the Vice President of the United States, who's, if not scowling, then something pretty close to scowling. I think that it doesn't necessarily mean that Kim has succeeded in dividing South Korea from the United States, but I would look for a lot of tension in the months and weeks ahead.
Tension because the South Koreans will resent this sort of overshadowing of what was supposed to be their moment, or just a sense that they don't believe the North Koreans are interested in any kind of reunification? That would be the biggest issue of all, or even any decent diplomatic relation.
Well, look, there's a lot of skepticism in South Korea, but right now there's skepticism in South Korea about Washington as well. Skepticism about the Trump
being
administration.
too hard on all this.
Absolutely. There's a new leader of South Korea, President Moon, who has decided that talks might be the way to go. He's now been invited to Pyongyang. If that summit comes off, I think you could see a real concern that the United States and Japan are trying to hold the line to be tough on North Korea, and that the South Koreans are interested in pursuing much more diplomacy and conversation.
Okay, excellent. We will revisit that. Susan, Mick Mulvaney, the budget director, said normal and reasonable this last week at the White House. Did it feel that way? Does it look that way? Do you think that most Americans watching this play out as they did said to themselves, yes, reasonable?
If this was an isolated incident, maybe, but this is about something much bigger than Rob Porter, right? This is about Roy Moore. This is about the Me Too movement. This is about the Access Hollywood tapes. This is about an administration and a president that time and time again has been dismissive of female voices and female concerns at a time when women voters are incredibly motivated. You have women running for office in the midterm elections at record levels. And you have a real anger among women in this country that they perceive men in power to not care about their concerns. And it also comes, I think, at a moment where, on Capitol Hill at least, Republicans have a much better story to tell. You know, also this week in the House, Republicans under Speaker Ryan passed a landmark piece of legislation to change the culture of Capitol Hill, to crack down on lawmakers who to make them pay out of pocket when they have these sexual harassment settlements that they're involved in.
Not a lot of headlines.
Not a lot of headlines.
Created
And
by
this
that
is the
particular
problem.
important piece of business, which you just identified.
They get no credit for it because what the president says and does overwhelms everything else. So the good things they're doing are completely negated.
Ramesh, speaking of what the president says, when he says due process, does that not open up for those 19 women who have said you assaulted or abused me in some way, give them the avenue at the president's own Twitter feed to seek due process?
I think it's in the back of everybody's mind when he talks about this issue, but you'll notice that the due process that he's concerned about is the due process for the accused. There has not been any expression of sympathy by the president.
We don't define due process on one side of the ledger in our country.
Right, but I think it's really remarkable. He says in his tweet, some of these allegations against people are true, but he doesn't say anything in sympathy for anybody who has been mistreated. People get their lives destroyed by allegations, he says. He doesn't talk about people getting their lives destroyed by actual abuse.
And the attendant trauma of abuse.
Up until he started commenting on it, I think you could have made the case that the president had been ill-served by his staff. But it was his decision to make these comments repeatedly in a way that I agree with Susan Davis. The president had been on a little bit of an upswing. He'd been going up in the polls. This is a completely self-generated political disaster.
Peter, do you believe the calm reassurances that there's no turmoil inside the West Wing?
A presidency with Donald Trump is guaranteed to have turmoil, right? I mean, he's walking turmoil. And part of what's happened here is, one of the points that the Me Too movement has tried to make, I think, is that environments where you do not have significant numbers of women in positions of power tend to breed tolerance for this kind of abuse. And this is a classic example of this, right? This is the least diverse administration, least diverse White House since at least the 1980s, if not before that, right? Does anyone imagine that if you had had a more genuinely diverse White House, that Rob Porter would have been able to survive for a year when you had these two ex-wives out there, when you had the FBI already gathering this information? It's a culture of tolerance that flows from the fact that it's an administration that looks nothing like the United States in 2018.
And yet Mick Mulvaney, Susan, said, no one should think we have a lax attitude about domestic abuse.
Well, not only does that sort of defy the facts, but I want to point out a couple of other important things. Number one, this is also a national security crisis, really, of a very significant level. So Rob Porter was in this crucial position, seeing all the paperwork, presumably including the nation's most classified secrets, with an interim security clearance. He was informed, General Kelly was informed, that there would be no permanent classified clearance for him. That is a violation, really, of basic principles. It suggests that the White House, far from having become a more orderly, disciplined place under John Kelly, has actually made an extraordinary exception and potentially given the nation's most classified secrets to somebody who the FBI believed was not worthy of a clearance. So that...
Now, it's my understanding that if you have an interim clearance, those things that are registered at the very top of the security pyramid you don't touch because you don't have it. So I think Rob Porter had a lot, but I've been told by those who are not necessarily in the White House but who are familiar with this general process that if you're on an interim basis, at the very top you don't see it.
Well, that's
this
why
would have been the Executive Secretary of the National Security Council who would have handled that.
Well, but that's what's so exceptional about the White House not having actually come forward with a clear and consistent account of the facts. We don't know yet what Rob Porter was actually handling and whether he did or not, number one. Number two, his clearance would have run out, his interim clearance, on January 15th of 2018.
And Ramesh, it's clear that his portfolio was enlarged when some of these issues were at least at some level known. Staff secretary is a big enough job, right, but he also, not just in terms of fact checking, but played a drafting hand in the State of the Union, but also was beginning to run trade meetings and interacting with those most concerned about future Trump trade policy.
Yeah, everything.
So it seems like a conscious decision was, you're not only good, you're extra good.
Everything we have heard from the administration is that they thought of him in very, very high terms. They trusted him, they relied on him, and that reliance was growing, not shrinking. And I think that we have the moral problem we've discussed here, we've got the security problem potentially, but we've also got this managerial problem. And it's been really stark relief as we've seen all of these conflicting accounts, all of this backbiting leaks surrounding this controversy.
And yet, Susan, the government continues to function. There is at least a bipartisan arrangement on the budget. There are details to be worked out over the next 6 weeks. We've got immigration right in the middle of it. When you talk to members, and when you did last week, was there a big sigh of relief around this budget deal in a sense that we can have some calm for a year and a half, even at a high cost?
There is certainly the expectation that at least what this deal does is end this cycle of shutdown threats and default threats for the next 2 years. What we don't know yet, and I think you heard that today from people like Congressman Meadows, is this a vote that comes back to haunt Republicans, right? Is this a vote that becomes an issue in primary races this year, in general elections? That the question of what is this party about and what does it believe in? And is fiscal responsibility still something that is at the core of what it means to be a conservative in Washington? And that vote this week undermined that for a lot of Republicans in Congress.
Peter, two issues for you. That, what is it, a Republican under President Trump? Mark Meadows just said the swamp's deeper since he got here. And two, what do you make of this clash between the House Intelligence Committee Democrats and the White House about this underlying memo, and Adam Schiff saying, I think everything the FBI did was proper? There's plenty of people who wonder if everything the FBI did was proper with Carter Page and the surveillance memo.
Right.
Surveillance warrant, forgive me.
You know, I think we have to move away from this narrative that the Republican Party used to be the party of fiscal responsibility and suddenly now has become irresponsible, right? We've seen this movie twice before, right? With Ronald Reagan and with George W. Bush. Big tax cuts, high levels of spending, wars that are paid for on the credit card, and then it's only when Democratic presidents come into office that the Republican Party freaks out about deficits and debt to the degree that in 2011, they were actually willing to default on the national debt, throwing the entire world into crisis.
Because it was such a big issue, theoretically.
Because it was quite a big issue. And now what they're doing is they're doubling the size of the debt when the economy is very strong, right? What any economist will tell you is that when the economy is strong, you want to reduce the debt. So the debt is low so you can stimulate the economy and have to increase the debt when the economy is weak. What you're now doing is you're overheating the economy, forcing the Federal Reserve to actually raise interest rates and undoing the very stimulus that you've just passed, right? This is how utterly incoherent this is, right? And I think we need to finally put a lie to this idea that the Republican parties ever really cared about fiscal responsibility. They care about cutting taxes. They care about military spending. They do not care about fiscal responsibility when it matters.
Susan, I want you to take this on in a couple of ways. One, does the defense spending increase make any difference in Asia in terms of the way the North Koreans look at our intentions, the way the Japanese, the way the Chinese? And secondarily, do you think the Chinese look at these fiscal choices and say the United States is in for some rough times that they may not even anticipate, and we're even stronger than we were a couple of months ago, comparatively, from an economic point of view?
Well, look, I think the Chinese in general, both, as you pointed out, on the budget politics, but just more generally on the Trump administration foreign policy, they might be the biggest winners in the entire world from the Trump administration. And I think there's a sense that while the long-term trends were already suggesting the relative rise of China compared with the United States, that Donald Trump has been like a dramatic accelerator of Chinese influence, power, and prestige around the world. That is being tested in some ways in this North Korea crisis. Can the United States work together more coherently with China on a major foreign policy problem? That's not clear at all. But the bottom line is that the economic investments, there's a lot of talk about budget increases for the military, for example. The strategic effort required to pivot to Asia has become the dream. It was the dream of the Obama administration. It might now be the dream of the Trump administration.
Yet to be realized.
That's right.
Ramesh, I know you want to jump in.
Yeah, I think
Got about 30 seconds.
One undercovered aspect of this, Republicans are also deciding they don't think they need to accomplish anything. They don't need a reconciliation bill. They don't need to use the power they have to amass a better record going into November. That's an interesting decision that they've made politically.
Well, give me 10 more seconds. What do you mean by that?
Because they, with this budget, have basically decided they are not going to try to pass major legislation with a majority vote in the Senate. They have foreclosed that option, practically speaking. You would think that they would want to maximize their use of that power while they still have the House and the Senate this year, but apparently not.
Susan, Ramesh, Peter, Susan, thank you so much for joining us. I'd like to thank all of you for being on the Face the Nation panel. We'll be back in just a moment with Joe Califano. He's a legend. Come back. Our next guest is Joseph Califano. He was a key and crucial advisor to President Lyndon Johnson and later was the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare under President Jimmy Carter. He's now on the CBS Board of Directors, and his 14th book, Our Damaged Democracy, We the People Must Act, is out Tuesday. Joe Califano, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here, Major.
What is damaged about our democracy?
It's in deep trouble. Let me just start.
Deeper than it was when you were in government?
Much deeper. I mean, we have a major crisis in the system. The president is so powerful he's overweening the other two branches.
This president or all presidents?
All presidents. It's been building for 50 years. They've all been the same. Every president increases power. We have they do more legislation than the Congress does.
Through regulations?
Through regulations. They put out about 20 regulations for any law Congress passes. That's number one. Number two, they have sent 100,000 people in the military to their death in combat. 1 million have been wounded in wars since 1945, World War II.
That have not been declared?
No declaration of war. They haven't even bothered. And indeed, with respect to Obama, for example, when he was in Libya, he went to Eric Holder as Attorney General, and he said, are these hostilities that I have to report to the Congress or get out? Holder said yes. Then he went to his own in-house counsel, who said, no, you don't have to do it, and he didn't do it. So they've got their own. The White House staff has exploded.
And Congress is to blame for letting the president gather that much power?
Congress is crippled and cowardly. Look at the Iran resolution. Congress pretzeled itself so it didn't have to in any way, shape, or form vote on Iran deal.
The nuclear deal, right.
The nuclear deal. Didn't have to vote on it because of for the Democrats, the problems of the Jewish vote and the Jewish money. They didn't want to be on record. They weren't on record. They had to enact a really, Cirque du Soleil way of getting around it. Mm-hmm. Number one. Number two, they don't use their appropriations power. You talked about this a little earlier, but I mean, they've been passing continuing resolutions for most of the last 20 years.
Right.
And the president has the power to supersede state law under the Constitution. It used to be the Congress that did that because federal law is the law. If there's a conflict with state law. Now the president does it by regulation.
I want to ask you one thing, because I think nostalgia can sometimes be dangerous. Is it your belief that things were all so much better in the 60s when government was essentially populated by white men around a table? Wouldn't you say now, whatever our problems are, there are far more voices, far more people with access to power that they didn't have back then?
There are. Thank God there are. But that's even very one-sided. The Democratic Party, the last time the Democratic Party got a majority of the white votes was when Lyndon Johnson ran in 1964. They built up their proportion of the black vote. It's been over 90%, except for Hillary Clinton, who only got 88%. On the Republican side, they now have a majority of the white vote. In the 60s, they have about 20 to 30% max of the black, down to 8% of the black vote. So we have this terrific split in the parties that fractures them. At the conventions this year, 50% of the Democratic convention was white, 25% was black. A Republican convention, 94 was white, and less than 1% was black. So we have a racial split. We really have racial parties, and we also have, and you know, I must say this, petty partnership that we never had then. Look, just your prior guest, I mean, can't Schiff talk to Nunez? I don't know if they talk to each other. They put a wall up between their staffs.
You mentioned the conventions, and one of the fascinating things I saw in your book is you're advocating that Americans participate in primaries far more than they do, because you have these very tiny percentages you identify in the book that produce nominees, which then the whole country has to deal with.
Right. Look at the last election. People say, "Oh, Hillary was, you know, she didn't offer anything. Trump was an egomaniac." Well, those were the two candidates. Hillary was picked by 8% of the registered Democrats. Trump by 7% of the registered Republicans.
That's a profound
So we all should
point.
look in the mirror.
And before we let you go, the opioid crisis in this country is real, and it's an emergency. You have an idea about that?
Well, the opioid crisis is real and it's an emergency. And this lack of trust is killing the ability of the government to deal with it. The government is uniquely positioned, the national government, because you really deal with the whole system. How do you make the pills? Do you make them so they're hard to abuse? That's the Food and Drug Administration. What do you do with the medical profession? How do you train them? What do you do with the hospitals? The ability to limit what they're putting out in pills. My wife got almost 100 pills. And then beyond that, what do parents do?
Right.
Because what's left in the medicine cabinet, that's where a third to a half of the kids get their first heroin.
And when we talk about an all-of-government response, opioid could be one if people got together.
If people got together and we had the kind of government we have, have a government that's
Joe,
crashing.
I gotta end it right there. Joe, thanks so much. Good luck on the book. And we'll be right back. That's what happens. Well, that's it for us today. Thanks for watching. For Face the Nation, I'm Major Garrett.